Welcome back to Danny Rants. This week I have a very special guest. Like every single week I have a special guest. Across from me I have a club promoter, a film director, and I also have a bondage master, Richard Masters from Hellfire. How are you?
Good, mate. How are you?
I'm pretty excited about this one. This is a unique and a little bit of an iconic, story when it comes to Melbourne's history.
Yes,
techno
you're in
to
trouble
bondage.
now. You're in the Hellfire zone.
So I guess for people who don't know who you are, can you give us a little bit of a wrap up of who Richard is pre and now?
Sure. Well, I'm an independent filmmaker. I run a film festival called the Melbourne Underground Film Festival. And in the 1990s, I was a nightclub promoter. I ran this event we're going to discuss tonight called the Hellfire Club. That was one of the more legendary clubs of the 1990s. I can talk about, how I got inspired to do that and many other people I know from the industry. But I've been running events in Melbourne probably every year since 1992. If they weren't the Hellfire Club events, they were the Melbourne Underground Film Festival or the film events that I've promoted, like bringing out Crispin Glover or many other interesting film people. So that's kind of my background. Film, the arts. I'm kind of a bit of a Renaissance person. So I make films. I show them. I love promoting the arts, and I'm also fascinated by events, happenings, art happenings, that kind of thing as well.
So Hellfire, the nightclub, starts in around 91, 92.
Starts in 1992 at Dream Nightclub. Yeah, that's when we started it. Yep.
So how are you inspired to do this?
Yeah, well, it's kind of an interesting story. I worked at Beat Magazine. I'm sure you know that magazine. I was the music editor there for about a year, from about 91, 92. I made my first feature film called Bloodlust in that period. And then I went to America, and I had this Jewish girlfriend in Los Angeles. I can name her. Her name's Regan Kibbe, and she was very kinky. She was about 8 years older than me. I was like 22 at the time. She was about 29, 30, and she was pretty wild. And she took me to all these kind of crazy kind of nightclubs in Los Angeles. One of them was called Cinematic, which was kind of similar to what I did with Hellfire. It was like, really cutting edge dance music, and it was this whole S&M thing, which was a kind of subculture at that time. And we went to a launch of a book called Research, Modern Primitives, which was the whole body piercing thing. And it was just probably around 1991. And, this launched the whole, and no one out in the suburbs had their, genitals pierced or their nose pierced. This launched the whole cult. And I went to the official launch of it, and there was a guy there called Bob Flanagan, who was like a, heavy masochist. He nailed, parts of his body to a board, things like this. I don't know. I mean, I'm from I grew up in Lower Templestowe. That's my hood, you know what I mean? So it's not exactly, it was a shock to me, all this stuff. So, but, there was a kind of scene, and, Madonna was sort of getting into the whole S&M thing. It was sort of going mainstream in that little kind of window. And when I came back, the girlfriend I had in Australia, she was having a birthday party, and she was holding it at a Dream nightclub. And I met Manny Sanchez and Ron Amster, who were the owners of Dream. And I told them about this club I went to in Los Angeles, and they liked the sound of it. And I said, I want to call it the Hellfire Club. And we opened in October 1992. And, for about a month, it did okay. Maybe numbers like 100, 200 people, just curious. But, And then we had the DJs were Ollie Olsen, Andrew Till, and David Thrussell. Ollie and Andrew played more in underground techno, and David played more electronic body music, industrial, and that kind of 80s electro stuff. And, so that was the kind of music we were playing. Then we decided to launch the club, and then a friend of Ollie's, Kate Sobrano, who of course we all know, decided to come along to the club to hear Ollie play. She didn't come along to get into the S&M, but she did come down and have a look, And just so happens that night there was a journalist there from the Truth newspaper. And on the front page that following Wednesday of The Truth, remember The Truth? You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Before your time. Anyway, The Truth was like this kind of trashy kind of newspaper. It had Kate Sobrano at Kinky Sex Club. And then the following week, we had 500 people at the door. You know what I mean? And then it just became massive. About 2 or 3 weeks later, we had Andrew Masterson, a journalist from The Age, come down, and a photographer from The Age. They took photographs, and they did like a whole 2 or 3 page article in the Sunday Age. And then it was just massive, about 6 months later, in March 93, on the 25th of March, I launched the Hellfire Club in Sydney, which of course, which I called it comes to the home of Australia's pervert, Sydney, and which of course is true. And that was just even more massive, And I flew up the same DJs. And I mean, because I didn't do that for too long because it's expensive, you know what I mean? But I remember Peter Raff told me, he said, that was one of the first clubs that was like a theme night, that was in more than one city. He said, you're one of the first people to do that in Australia, which I thought was a nice compliment because he obviously went on to do that with, was it One Love? And
One Love he did it with, yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
But not many people have. It's like one of those things that's like, few and far between promoters have been able to successfully do that.
There you go. So, I think it was original. Obviously, I was inspired by people locally, people like Gavin Campbell. I'd attended Razor when I was about 20, it would have been 1989, around that time. I was sort of a goth, you know what I mean? I dressed in black. I thought I was Gary Newman. I wore the eyeliner and, this kind of thing. It just, women liked it or whatever. So that's kind of why I was into it. I don't do it anymore, obviously. But I was also attracted to that style of music. I was really influenced when I was young by, what's called the New Romantic School of Music, bands like Ultravox and Soft Cell and Heaven 17 and all that kind of early 80s electro stuff. Talk. I loved all this kind of electronic stuff that came out of the early 80s. And I followed many of these bands right through to today pretty much, and it became like a burgeoning thing. Depeche Mode, they're like my favorite band when I was a teenager, you know what I mean? So, from this, I was inspired very much by what Gavin was doing with Razor. And, I saw like Triple R magazine had like Gavin on the front cover about a year before I started Hellfire. And I remember just thinking when I saw that, it's kind of an interesting thing to do. And I was also really interested in people like Andy Warhol, who did really interesting kind of like nights, like the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, that was like, combining art and music and like a band like, say, the Velvet Underground, and then, say, kinky performances. And that is kind of what, inspired what I was doing with Hellfire.
When you go to Razor, right, you talk about how it inspired you. Can you run through, for someone like myself who never went there, why and how Razor inspired you?
Razor to this day is one of the greatest clubs I ever went to. It was at this kind of, it was like a sports club or a bowling club.
It was actually a car club, light car club it was.
There you go, the light car club is correct. Absolutely correct. And it was on, near where they do the Grand Prix there, in Albert Park. And, it was, I guess, a building that you would not normally associate with nightclubs, but that they decked out. And it just everybody that was cool at the time. I remember the first time I went there, I think, Michael Hutchence was there with Kylie Minogue, and they were just like kissing and cuddling, and no one cared. You know what I mean? No one was coming up to them and going, oh, you know what I mean? They were just treated as normal people. And it just had this cool atmosphere. It was gay friendly, so it was like, it was pushing edges in that. The music was fantastic. Before that, I'd been to clubs. I'd been to your more goth kind of stuff, the clubs that were run by people like Steve Wyatt and Anthony Horan. They ran, clubs like Subterranean and things like this that played, all your classics like your Cure and your Smiths and all this kind of stuff, and also all the electronic stuff. And, I'd been going to those, but I thought that the Razor Club was something else. And, it was kind of a work of art, you know what I mean? And also the flyers had a unique look. And I remember it was very hard to get a membership, you know what I mean? And you sort of had to be in the know. Or you also had to have an attitude, and, had to have a certain look. And I don't know how I got in, but, I didn't. As I said, I grew up in Lower Templestowe. I was hardly the coolest kid, you know what I mean? As a teenager, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, you know what I mean? Couldn't get a girlfriend when I was like 14 or whatever. But by the time I'm 23, I'm running the Hellfire Club. So I don't know what happened, but somehow in between I became a degenerate or cool or whatever.
So the word Hellfire, right? The name comes from clubs back in England, I believe. Can you run me through where that name originally comes from and why you picked it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've always been a student of history. I'm something of something of an intellectual. You know what I mean? I have a degree in philosophy. So I'd studied the history of this kind of thing, and it began as a kind of what's called a libertines club, the writings of the Marquis de Sade. This all happened around the time of the French Revolution, right? And in England, there was something similar to the Marquis de Sade called the Hellfire Club. A guy by the name of Sir Francis Dashwood, held these parties in caves where aristocrats, for example, Benjamin Franklin, one of the founders of America, he attended many of these parties. And it was a bit of a secret club, a bit like the Masons, maybe, where you could do business behind closed doors. And it was known for being wild. They would invite prostitutes and also ladies of society who could, loosen their morals on that night. Because this is a time when you could still probably get hanged for being a witch, you know what I mean? So, it was very, very risque to do this. And it was something that only happened within the elite. So I was aware, I had a couple of biographies on this person, and I just liked the name. And I knew there was a S&M club in New York called the Hellfire Club that was mainly a gay thing. And I'd heard about that. And I thought, I wanted it to be gay friendly, but I wanted it also to go to the suburbs a little bit. I wanted people, just anybody could come who had an interest in this kind of thing. So we just launched it, and And we had a reasonably strict door, we had a really great door bitch there, Lisa Hutchinson, who I ended up dating, believe it or not. And, which that's not that surprising, but it was fascinating doing that, and that's how it all came about, I guess.
So when you go to Warren and Manny and you walk up to them and say, hey, I want to run this S&M club, and they say yes.
Yeah, they did.
How do you actually launch it?
Well, I think at the time, I just said, look, Dad, I borrowed like $2 or $3 grand from my dad or whatever just to run it for the first month. And as I said, it was doing okay. It was kind of paying for itself, and so I think I paid my dad back the $3 or $4 grand or whatever it was. And then Kate Sobrano attended. And then, we're charging like $15, $20 a head. And then we've got 500 people there every weekend. And we used to have lines around the block. For a long time, it was really very, very cool in that period in the 90s. And when the Sydney one opened, I was doing very well out of the two clubs. And I also opened the Brisbane Hellfire Club, I ran that personally for maybe about 18 months. It was very hard to run because think about it, I'm up all night, all Sunday night. Melbourne was Sunday night. Like Sydney was Thursday night. Can't even remember when I did Brisbane, probably Friday night. So I'm flying between all the cities. And it's fun in the first month doing that, you know what I mean? But then it's becomes like a band, here we go again, And, so after a while, I just got sick of doing that. We opened it in Canberra, of all places. And I'd started dating Lisa, who ran the door, and she also became one of the mistresses and out the back after she left the door. And she also ran the Canberra Hellfire Club, which had a lot of politicians, a lot of major politicians. I don't think I can mention them, sorry, who came there. It was just about everybody.
It's almost stereotypical to think that politicians would be there.
All the Liberals, mate. All the Liberals were there lining up to get their 50 lashes or whatever. They were there with bells on. And so we did that. We could be shooting blackmail footage, so we could have made a fortune. But no, we didn't do anything like that. And then I tried to open it in Adelaide. I was building an empire, essentially. And when I went over to Adelaide, I did the usual spiel, which you've seen on some of the cards. I said, comes to the home of Australia's perverts, Adelaide. But they read it out in Parliament. Like the Premier of South Australia read that out. And they didn't like it, you know what I mean? And then I got called in, before like the chief of police, and they were trying to work out if I was contravening like licensing laws and, because it was never anything they'd seen before in Adelaide. Because it's the city of churches, all this stuff. And I was just taking the piss out of all that in my flyer. And then, they interviewed me and then they just said, turn off the camera, or they were recording it, turn it off. And they said, listen, look, you're not doing this here, so fuck off or it's going to be trouble. We'll stitch you up kind of thing. So there you go. So I basically, cameras came back on. I said, all right, well, thank you. And I just didn't do it. I said to the people at the venue in Adelaide, I can't do it. But of course, since there's been people who've run theme nights like this. And that's the other thing too. Hellfire really inspired a lot of this stuff that's now normal, you know what I mean? And now you see this kind of S&M activity just going on in a gay parade, which is just, they're teaching it in schools now, you know what I mean? But back then it was forbidden and, it was different times, man.
So this is pretty obvious thing. I'm just thinking as I talk about, obviously I know Hellfire, you know Hellfire, but people who are watching this maybe have never ever heard of Hellfire. Sure. Walk me through what the experience felt like when you walked in and how the S&M was actually combined with techno, because techno was a massive part of what you guys did.
Yeah, it was. Well, at the time, I'd been to some raves, A Better Tomorrow, and I knew people like Spiro, from Earthcore. He was an old friend. He started around the same time I started Hellfire. And a lot of these people, I also knew the boys from Filter. I don't know if you know Filter, like Jason Rude Boy and Mad Rod.
And Lounge, yeah?
They're Lounge, there you go. And, this was just a burgeoning thing. Ollie Olsen was like the key to this. I knew Ollie essentially from the band Max Q that he did with Michael Hutchins. And, just when I wanted to start the club, my dream DJs were essentially Ollie and David Thrussell. And David Thrussell's in a band called Snog. And he was being played at the time all over Triple J. With his first album, Corporate Slave, the song that they did then. And they were the two that their music was all over the radio. And I just thought, and they were experts in this kind of electronic music. And so, when I was going to do the club, I approached them and Ollie could just tap into all this. And he said, well, this will be great. We need a week, because obviously there are raves, but he said, there's no real weekly techno club at the moment. I think maybe there was Filter. I think Filter started around the same time, but there wasn't many. There was maybe only one other or maybe a couple. But so, and it was also Sunday night. So it was like an end of the week night, So, if you wanted just to dance, you would go upstairs, And then, of course, ecstasy was just the thing then. Everybody was on ecstasy. When I first started doing it, I was 23. I'd never even had a joint, right? But a year later, things had changed. You know what I mean? Let's put it that way. I'd had a knee. Someone had given me a knee. Someone had given me a line of speed. So off I went in my merry way. And this whole scene was burgeoning. So a lot of people would take E to the dance music, and then they'd walk downstairs. And then downstairs we would have like an A-frame, different kind of bondage and discipline apparatus. And then we would have Master Perry was one of the major, he was like the male master. We had all different kinds of women, and often to do things like strip clubs and stuff. They would finish, work, and they would come down at say midnight on a Sunday night, and just take part. And you wouldn't even pay them; they just get up and do scenes. And people were taking E, and it was very sexual atmosphere. So it was a combination of, just a free libertarian and libertine atmosphere, open sexuality, gay, straight, whatever. And people were just getting into everything. And people were fucking in the corners of the building. We couldn't believe it. Anywhere you'd open a door, someone had gotten in the broom closet and be having sex. And, people were snorting coke in the toilets or whatever. It was like the fall of Rome, mate. And we had a good time, And that's what it was about. And that's, I guess, what I was trying to do, really. It does, it does affect you after running a club like that. I ran that for about, I moved it. We can go into where I moved it to, but that lifestyle does catch up with you after a while.
The people that were coming through, there was a whole bunch of punters, right? You had people who were experienced in that world, in that bondage S&M world.
Yes.
And then there was people that had never seen it, were probably coming down for
That's
a rubberneck.
Mm-hmm.
So those people, were they coming in and getting involved? Was some shocked? Did you ever have situations of people leaving disgusted or anything like that?
You occasionally would. You occasionally would. The two rules is that, you had to be over 18 to enter the club, and it just had to be consensual. So you had to, like Master Perry would say, you want to do this, and you have a limit, or we'd have a safety word, which is like, if someone's getting whipped or spanked or whatever, you would just say whatever, orange or whatever that word is that you chose, and that would end the thing, and the next person could get up. But there tends to be never any shortage of people who wanted to get involved. And there was also, we would have shows, we would have people come and, sword swallowers and burlesque dancers. We would do all different kinds of shows. We had the Jim Rose Circus Sideshow. They came through town. We had Kenneth Anger, the underground filmmaker from America. He came and did like a satanic ritual at the club. He was connected to, bands like, what's it called, the Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin. He was like a mentor to Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. So this guy was a legend from the 60s. So all kinds of interesting people came through the club, and we just wanted to, provide a kind of safe space for people to do this. Occasionally something got out of hand. Occasionally a couple of people were a bit crazy. We had one guy come down one night. He wanted to essentially be beaten up. You know what I mean? Like punched up. And no. And then, of course, when we wanted to kick him out, he started fighting with the security because that's what he wanted anyway. So that, some people had, you do have to watch that. There's the odd person, maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 is a bit nuts. And then you just have to escort them off the premises and never let them back in. But, we had that up in Sydney as well, and but basically it was fun. You had the vanilla people who came along, and then you had the people who were really into it, who came regularly. And the vanillas came and had a perv, and some of them got into it, some of them got up. And, we had many people from many different bands. We had Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream came down. He was more interested in the techno, but he came downstairs and had a perv, very similar, story up in Sydney.
Did you have music in the bondage era?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes different, but sometimes we just pumped down what was playing upstairs. Sometimes we'd play, a lot of just stuff that suited the sexual vibe. I remember bands like, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, Ministry. We played a lot of this kind of stuff in the S&M area. 9 Inch Nails, of course, which was very much, that was, we would have their videos on repeat. They did these very S&M kind of videos around that time. They did the Downward Spiral. This is exactly in the time that Hellfire was happening, the Downward Spiral. That's 92, 93. So this just seemed to be something in the air. And, we sort of, it was a zeitgeist thing, We just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and it just went off,
So you talk about sex in nightclubs, and that's something now it's super forbidden, right? You can't do that at all. Yeah, it's unless it's an actual sex club like Inflation or whatever.
There you go.
So how were you able to do that back then, or was it just no cameras?
Well, this is it. We had police come to all the clubs. The people in Melbourne and Sydney never said we were doing anything that was that, because basically it was a performance that involved, it was like a live show, and then you'll get people out of the audience. I don't know, maybe it was contravening some law, but no one ever No one ever bothered us. As I said, in Adelaide, they weren't going to let us, so that never went ahead. We just announced one night. In Canberra, it was never a problem, but after 8 months, we just got sick of going between so many cities. And then with Brisbane, I could only do Melbourne and Sydney. You know what I mean? Like with Brisbane, I stopped going to Brisbane after maybe about 18 months, and then someone else took over. I don't even know who the hell that is. Someone else took over the idea, and I just thought, well, fuck, I'm just let them do it, you know? So that's apparently still running to this day. So
obviously, no doubt you would have seen some crazy stuff, right, in this space. Is there one memory that comes to mind of one of the craziest experiences that you had in Hellfire?
Wow, there are many, mate. There are many.
Tell us a couple then.
I don't know whose idea it was, but we had this idea one night. The water everyone would drink at Dream was called Split Rock. And some larrikin, I won't say who it was, but you probably know him, and came up with the idea to do a thing called Replitzok, which is where, you basically make a, what's it called? Like a, thing they had, Kool-Aid, you know what I mean? You pour the Replitzok and you pour, say, cordial in there, and then you put a little bit of something else in there as well, you know what I mean? Something of a psychedelic nature. And everybody would come and get a free cup of Replitzok. And next thing you know, you're off, on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, mate, LSD. And next thing you know, everyone's off flying around the room, and the roof has popped off, and the sky is everywhere, and So this happened a couple of times. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but it did. And so Replitzok was quite legendary. We had many crazy nights. I mean, we would also close the club at maybe 6 a.m. in the morning, but that wasn't the end. You know what I mean? We would often keep back 20 people. There'd be like maybe 5 or 6 guys, and we'd maybe keep back 15 girls. We'd close the thing up and we'd party right through to midday, you know what I mean? Or we'd get a hotel room, and, at this stage, there's all kinds of drugs and all kinds of things going on. So it was definitely the film Caligula, I don't know if you've seen that. Yeah,
and the term was lock-in, right? Like there was not a regular sort of, I'd say probably 2005 before, that the club would close and they would just lock it in. And if you left, just let yourself out, you couldn't come back in. That's right. It was like not an uncommon thing, but these days, too many cameras, there's no way you could get away with that.
Yeah, I went up to a friend's club, Benny, who started 161. He runs elsewhere, and coming into a club, he took my photo. Everyone had to get their photo taken. It was like Big Brother, man. You know what I mean? It's like, what the hell's going on? You know what I mean? This is not the way. Not the way it was in our day. I guess it's just the way things are. Not everywhere. There are still some underground clubs still, or it's more easygoing to go to a venue. But I think there was a great sense of freedom, and that's what I loved about the 90s. Everybody was just easygoing. There was none of this bullshit, none of this political correctness, none of this wokeness, whatever. Everyone was just accepting of each other. And you could have different opinions. You could be this, that, and the other. No one gave a shit. You were just accepting. And, and it was all about free speech. It was all about open expression. And I thought it was a really incredible decade. The 2000s wasn't too bad either. You know what I mean? It was pretty free. It's only really in the last 10 or 15 years that things sort of began to go in the wrong direction, I think, which is sad because I think, our civilization had reached a point of, great libertarianism or libertinage, which I think was a positive thing. And I don't know how it's kind of regressed, but I guess it had.
I talked about before with the techno and the music and the BDSM and obviously Hellfire. Yep. You had some legendary artists there. Is there some that you can remember, like guys, for example, that I know that played there was guys like Richard McNeil, Melbourne icon. Yep. On top of that, there was Hellraiser, who went on to become one of the biggest stars in 2000s. Was there any other artists that you sort of had there that come to mind?
Well, we had, obviously you mentioned Simon Digby before. We had him play. We had Jason DaCosta. We had Jason Midrow. We had, just about every major DJ had at least one guest spot at Hellfire over the years. We had, international artists. I think Fatboy Slim played there one night. What's his name? The guy who's in the band Hazy Fantasia. I can't remember his name. He became a DJ. He was in an 80s band. You can look him up online. You can tell us. We had all kinds of people. If people were touring, if they were DJs or involved in a band that come down. We had many celebrities come to the club. We had George Clooney come down one night. I can tell you about that. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, tell me. I'd love to hear it.
All right. Well, we weren't running the club a Dream anymore. Well, there'd been a dispute. Sadly, there'd been a dispute with a couple of the owners and. Warren had left Dream and Manny was still there. And then we ended up at Saratoga, which is the Goldsmith family. I'm sure you know them. Brian Goldsmith. Of course, there's Toddy Goldsmith. Yep. And I worked with Brett Goldsmith. He was like the manager of Saratoga in those days. And it was really popular there too. And that was when we kind of changed styles of music. We went from You kind of techno. Ollie was no longer DJing there. We had like Arlen, I'm sure you know.
Alan De Silva.
Arlen De Silva,
Yep.
and we had Donnie One, who's over in Bali now. And we had a lot of house DJs. And also the promoters at the time who worked for me were like Chris Knight, who went off to found Monkey soon after he worked for me. Alex Mate was there, of course. Jason Naubi, of course, went on to form Future with Mark. So anyway, we're running at Saratoga, and I knew that George Clooney was in town, and here he is. He rocks up. And I think, well, this is good. So obviously, let him in for free, give him free tickets or whatever. And I said, look, can we take a few photographs? And he said, yes, as long as you ask, that's okay. And there was a photographer there, Robin Delamore, because he just made the film Batman. So he was Batman. And then I said to Robin, look, he's okay with photos, but we have to ask permission. So, we get a couple when he was first turned up. So I get a shot with him and everything. And then, he's there and he goes on the dance floor. He's dancing with some chick. And we're giving him, like access to the private office. And let's just say there was a bit of a Scarface going on there, this kind of thing, you know what I mean? And, everyone was very happy and vibed up. And so he's out on the dance floor and he's with this girl because he's dating some famous girl back in the States. And he doesn't want to have photographs of him dancing with some tart he's picked up in Melbourne, right? And so Robin, unbeknownst to me, is snuck out and he's taking photographs of George Clooney dancing with this girl, which I imagine he thinks he's going to sell to the Herald Sun for $5,000 or whatever. He probably would have got that, you know what I mean, for these photos. But of course, George Clooney catches him and then grabs him and then wants to beat the hell out of this guy. And then the security come and then they want to beat up the photographer. And of course, the photographer's a friend of mine. So we all move to the office and he's like, what's this? This is not what we agreed on kind of thing, And I said to, Robin, what are you doing? You know what I mean? And it was funny too, because it was like Batman versus Robin, you know what I mean? And which was amusing. And so anyway, Clooney says this. Clooney goes, look, I'm staying at Crown Casino. Give me because it was film back in the day. It wasn't digital. He says, give me the film. I'll get up in the morning, right? It's like 2 a.m. I'll get up in the morning and I'll meet you in the lobby at Crown Casino and I'll give you the photos I approve of. And the ones I don't, I'll keep and destroy. I said, that sounds reasonable. And then, Robin didn't get beat up and George Clooney was happy. He got the film. We finished up the night. He must have gone home at around 4. Imagine he didn't sleep that night. But anyway, I figure, well, this is not going to happen. I'll never see him again. But anyway, I'll go down and see if he turns up. So I rock up to Crown Casino in the lobby, of the hotel. And then 10 a.m., right on a knocker, down comes George Clooney with the photographs. And he goes, there you go. And he'd been up at 9. He'd gone to a 1 hour place and got them done. And I couldn't believe it. You know what I mean? I could not believe it. And he was a perfect gentleman. Really nice, and he was also great for hospitality. And he wasn't particularly arrogant, or you know what I mean. A lot of these Hollywood people, he'd been a celebrity before, but not in a major way. That Batman film was the first really major thing, and he said things like, over a few bevies that night, he said like, I think I fucked up Batman. I think I've destroyed like a franchise. It's like undestroyable. I think I fucked it up. He was very self-deprecating and funny, and I thought he was a top bloke. And then about 6 months after, he was in some other big film. It was like a military thing. And then, he just became an absolutely massive star after that. So, he came to we had Bono come to the club. That was when I was at the Mansion. We were running it with Mark James. Of course, I've seen Mark James' episode here on the show, which is great. We were running it with the Mansion boys. That was like Mark James, Jason Naubi. And, we had the U2 boys there. Bono and a few of the others, So, we've had lots of different celebrities come to the club over the years.
You have Michael Hutchins too, right?
Yeah. We had that before he sadly died, because he was a friend of Ollie's. And as I said, Bobby Gillespie and this other band, The Living End, the lead singer of The Living End, whoever the hell that is. We had all, I can't even remember, and we had all different kinds of people come along, and we had all kinds of journalists and judges and police and, everybody came, Everyone was sort of fascinated by it. It was sort of a curious, a blip on the nightclub landscape, but it somehow fitted into what was going on in the 90s, there was things like the Tasty raid, Warren was the manager of Tasty. And we'd often go there on a Saturday night, and Manny and I would pop down there because Warren was the manager. So we'd get the run of the joint, and we thought that was an incredible club. And, we heard about the raid. We heard about the raid the night it happened. We got a call about 4 hours before the raid happened. and said, "Oh, it's getting raided. Don't go down to Tasty tonight." And we're like, "Oh shit, that's good news. We're not going down there." But then everybody who went there made like $5,000 or $10,000, and now we're kicking ourselves. We didn't go down there.
I think it was more. I think their whole thing was about $6 million.
Was it really?
Yeah, so I think they made a lot more than $5,000.
Who are those bastards that called us? We would have made, we would have made $50,000 each if we'd gone down there that night. But we would have definitely been there normally. And we used to, that was incredible. That was, as I said, mainly a gay club, but there were also straight people there, and it was just this, fantastic attitude. I've never seen anything like it. And, also, too, it reminded me a little bit of, like, the club kids from New York. I don't know if you've heard about them.
Yeah.
Michael Alec and all that kind of school.
Macaulay Culkin did a movie about it.
There you go, Party Monster. There you go.
That's right.
Yeah, and, like, about a year or two into Hellfire, I went over to New York, and I met him, and I went to, it's something called We Are the Robots or something. It was a night called We Are the Robots or iRobot or something like that. And there was, like, Club USA, which was, like, the Jean-Paul Gaultier club, and people were just snorting cocaine off the floor. I mean, it's just things we did are amazing. We're still alive. I remember we went to Sound Factory, and the line was like, like about 1 kilometre long. And I was there with this, 6'1" girlfriend, and she just walked up and goes, let us in. We're from Australia. We run the Hellfire Club. And I know how she did it. But the doorman said, "Come right in, sweetheart." And there we were, and we're hanging out. I think it was he was the guy who used to remix all the albums for Madonna. Jimmy Benitez, is it Jelly Bean? That's his name. He was the DJ at Sound Factory. So, we got to meet all kinds of extraordinary people. Whenever we traveled, we went to other kind of like, kinky sex clubs when we were overseas. We went to one called Submission in London, and Lisa and I, we got picked up by this other couple, and we were off our fucking heads on ease. And we got taken down to Brighton, right, to this mansion, right? And we thought these people must be like, royalty or something like this. And it was like literally like, to the manor born, Brideshead Revisited kind of house. So anyway, we're doing all this, God knows, we're just off our fucking tree for days, like sex orgies and shit with this other couple. And then we were told that the guy who owned the house was an Aussie, was a famous photographer, I can't remember his name, but that he'd been photographing us the past few days. And we're like, what? You know what I mean? So we were there. We would have only been like 23, 24. This photographer had apparently been taking clandestine photographs of us, And you
didn't spot him around their property?
No, he had mirrors and shit. But we did see him. We saw him out in the lawn, and because we went for a walk one day, I think after about 2 days of doing this, we thought we need to go for a walk, And then we just wandered around eating off our heads. And I remember we walked through a field and like playing, what's it called, cricket and everything. We're just like, fuck. So I don't know. After about 3 days, we said, we've got to get out of here. We've got a cab back to London,
So you talk about the drug scene back then and how it was like free loving, the sex scene, people having sex in every basement closet that they possibly could. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you were living in a libertarian society with people like-minded like yourself. Yep. When it comes to nightclubs, club people have always been very, very open. Yep. LGBTQ community basically started what we love today. Yeah. Police, no doubt, didn't. And government maybe didn't, so maybe they were coming down. What was some of the backlash you were having in the space of Hellfire and during that period of time from those sort of government bodies?
Well, we did things that would, upset people. We did things like, come dressed as a Nazi night. You know what I mean? That didn't go over too well. You know what I mean? The Jewish Community Council tried to take us to get that stopped. That was, of course, the front page of the Herald Sun. I did some other tribute to G.J. Ballard, who's like a favourite author of mine. I love William Burroughs and I love G.J. Ballard. He wrote that book, Crash, which is about how people drive cars into each other for erotic pleasure, which, of course, is not really a real fetish, but it's a kind of crazy theme of this book. And I did a tribute to that. It was sort of interpreted as encouraging people to drive in a terrible way, because it wasn't. It was just a tribute to this unusual science fiction novel that this author had written. That was on the front page of the Herald Sun. There were a number of things like that we did that were just, we did tributes to Soviet Russia. And, just people would call up and complain and, I don't know, what are you going to do? You know what I mean? I've always been somebody, I love being provocative. That's why I love being in the 90s, because now, with cancel culture and all this stuff today, it's terrible. You know what I mean? Like, I could never have done what I did now that I did then, because it was just such a free atmosphere, and people understood that I just enjoyed being provocative. And I thought, it's the same with being a filmmaker and stuff. I just enjoy challenging people and, starting interesting conversations about free speech or ideas and stuff. And that's always what motivated me behind what I was doing.
So what about the church stuff? So I've seen there was a bit of backlash from the church at times in different states.
Yes, there was. Yep. Well, I mean, the church always tried to kind of, get banned, but I didn't think it was necessarily it's called the Hellfire Club. I guess that name itself is enough to upset them, But, I mean, outside of occasionally having an occultist maybe do a talk or a ceremony or something, we never really, I was sending up, the idea of groups like the Illuminati or the New World Order. I was sending up all this stuff, taking the piss. There was no real secret societies like this in Melbourne that I could see, at least that I was invited to. And we were just having our own fun with these ideas. And obviously some religious people complained about it. I mean, people's parents and stuff, my own dad thought it was funny. My mother didn't particularly like it, So there you go, you know what I mean? So, it's always something to piss off your parents, but I think, when you're young, you like to do that.
So the dominatrix and masters you were getting, you had to go find them, right? So you're out there scouting these people in all these different states. Mm-hmm. How did you get into this world to be able to find these people?
Well, as I said, I really didn't know that world too well until I started it, you know what I mean? And it was like the club itself was like, a light to a moth, you know what I mean? They would just come and you would just meet them, I mean, I didn't know Master Perry when I started, but pretty soon after starting the club, I did, you know what I mean? And then he knew people. And then, as I said, Lisa was the door girl. And then, I started dating her, and pretty soon she said, I'd like to go out and work in the back room, which is a lot more fun, just whipping the shit out of people. It's kind of easy, easy work, in between drinks. And so, it was kind of like therapy too to a lot of people. Some people would come and they found it more productive than 6 months with a therapist, you know what I mean? Because it was very, it gets the endorphins flowing and, so for some people it was very positive. I don't know, maybe some people didn't like it. Maybe some people came in, didn't like what they saw and left. I'm sure that would have been the case, but, it was one of those places, you sort of knew what you're in for if you come into a place like the Hellfire Club. And, people were pretty upfront as to what it was about. Some people were curious, at least 90% I'd say who came enjoyed it, and maybe the 10% who didn't either just went upstairs and enjoyed the dance music or they left, and then they got to see what it was about, and that was that. But we had lots of different people come from all over the years, from all walks of life, and it's just always been something interesting, in my life.
I feel like there's always been a fascination with this stuff because a lot of people can't understand people who would enjoy that.
Yeah.
Did you have a certain clientele that would come down that were actually there for the bottom room? Or is there like a myth sort of that you can dispel for the people that did come down to enjoy it?
Well, it's like, S&M is something, it's just like, I got into it because I like spanking women, you know what I mean? I found that erotic or whatever. And, most women I met seem to like that too. And that seems to be a pretty common fetish. It's almost like the film 50 Shades of Grey, became, a book that sold the level of Harry Potter, you know what I mean? And it wasn't men that was buying that book. It was women, right? Women love that fetish. Women love S&M. And that was something that was interesting, because women use their heads more with sexuality. With men, it's more, 2 or 3 minutes and job's done, you know what I mean? And it's not like we all know that. But like, with women, they like to involve, thoughts and seduction and things like sadomasochism, plays to that. And I found it tremendously popular with women, but obviously with men as well, So it was just something that people found fascinating. Some people might like different aspects of it, the bondage stuff, the actual physical things like getting whipped or spanked or whatever. Some people pour hot wax or, would just find that sensual or whatever. And some people just enjoy watching it, They wouldn't want to participate, but they would have a voyeuristic pleasure from it. And so, that's what happened. And, we supported, whatever people wanted to do. And also we would get, two, really full-on leather guys come down who are dressed up like people from the, what's it called, Tom of Finland, or like the Village People or whatever. And they would do some full-on gay thing, or there'd be a lesbian couple who would do scenes. So, it would just happen. Like, it was impromptu. As I said, it was like a kind of an art happening. At its best, it was like something like some kind of Warhol happening, where things would just, and then people would be taking ecstasy. The night would go off in all kinds of directions.
Yeah, it's such an interesting space to imagine now because as we talked about before we jumped on camera, the idea of this is now it's almost somewhat impossible to the mainstream level that it was, like to be a point where you're talking about some of the most influential DJs coming and playing. Yeah. Nowadays, if you were to take those same people and put them in a place like this, I don't even know if it could happen. And it's now they're segregated, right? So it's gone back underground, and then your commercial scene your dance scene is now the commercial.
Yeah.
Why do you think that one became underground again, but the other one became commercial? So dance now being commercial, and obviously the sex stuff being underground.
I don't know why that happened. I just think society has gone, more conservative the last 15 years, and not in a good way. And I think on the left and right, you know what I mean? They've both sides of politics have gone a bit crazy, attacking each other, and we've become very internecine. Whereas like back then, things were a lot more accepting. Even into the 2000s, people were very accepting. I don't know why that is. I mean, after I kind of wound down getting involved in clubs, after about 10 years, after about 2002, I wasn't doing Hellfire events that much anymore. And but other people sort of picked up the mantle, like Isadora Van Camp and Robert Foresso do Purr, which is like every couple of months they do. That's kind of similar to what we were doing at Hellfire. And people like the Colonel and stuff, they had Abode or whatever down in down near Fitzroy Junction around there, and they did events and stuff. And so people sort of carried on this legacy. I don't know why times changed, but I mean, obviously nightclubs were kind of a big deal, things like, I remember going to things at places like, Heat Nightclub or whatever at Crown, it was one of the places we'd hang out, and I might make $5,000 on a night, go down, maybe blow $500 on the stupid fucking blackjack. I'd end up at Heat, commiserating. I knew Glenn Coburn, of course, who worked at Heat. The Glens used to run Heat, So I got to know everybody, and I met some wonderful people, running clubs and some really great friends. It's been fantastic watching them on your show, seeing legends like Peter Raff, of course. Raffy, we knew. He used to come to Hellfire and he was always promoting his own events. And it was just tremendous to see him, be so successful. And, when he sold that rave party, what was the name of that again? Stereosonic. I mean, that was fantastic. And, it's just great, all that crew that were connected to that. And it was also great to see the Future Boys have all that success in the last 20 years, and, I think it's been great. And I'm still friends with most of the people I knew. And as I said, I catch up regularly with people like Benny, who started 161. Of course, everyone knows that with Hank, 161's still going, and he runs elsewhere still up on the Gold Coast, which is a great club, by the way. If you ever get up to the Gold Coast.
I've been there heaps.
Yeah, you go,
Yeah, it's so
cool.
good.
I mean, who would ever think there'd be a cool club on the Gold Coast?
It's the only one.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because that's Benny, mate. Benny, he was like one of the coolest guys I met. And we were very close friends. He used to live in this, it was almost like a squat, you know what I mean? And, all kinds of things going on in that house, mate. We shouldn't discuss. But all kinds of interesting things going on in that house. People had to move states and things when that all came to a crashing end.
But that's the thing with nightclubs, right? They're some of the most interesting people, and they continue to be. So hopefully the next generation will be.
Exactly. We're here to inspire, ladies and gentlemen, And I think, this younger generation, this needs to be a bit wilder, We were doing things that were, we were breaking the law, mate. People were doing like illegal raves and warehouses, and people were just bending the, pushing the envelope, and that's what we were definitely doing at Hellfire. Like, we're pushing the envelope of what you get away with. And obviously, as I said, in a place like Adelaide, they wouldn't let us get away with it. But everywhere else they did. And you'd be surprised if you do push the envelope, you can get away with it, And what things like the authorities, they come down and we would have police come in and have a perv. They'd stay and they'd have a drink. We'd give them a drink, Maybe it was just a cordial or something,
You reckon?
Not a Replitz sock, I hope.
It's such an interesting piece of advice, though, because you're right. Like, I reflect on now, and I talk to a lot of young people. I'm lucky to be able to do that. Yeah. And my one is like, just give it a go. But it's true, like, be more wild. Break. And they say, I wish I got to live what you got to live. And I'm like, the difference between what you guys are living and what we lived is that we lived in the moment, and and it was wild. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of fights. There was a lot of gangsters. There was a lot of sex. There was all those things that, people romanticize. But that's what made it special. And sometimes you're on the bad end of that, and sometimes you're on the good end of that. But what it did do was made for wicked stories, right?
Yeah, we had Carl Williams come to the Hellfire Club quite regularly when it was at Mansion. He would come down, and I just got told to give him, we had Gary Ablett Sr. come down. He was a bit of a party boy in that period, And, we had all kinds of interesting people come and go from the club, and it was, extraordinary.
And what was like, taking from that, like meeting all these interesting people, what's sort of one thing that you would say from meeting people from gangsters to rock stars to people who were just into what people would deem strange sex acts? Sure. What was the one thing that you would say that you found that they had in common?
Well, I think curiosity, you know what I mean? And, we weren't breaking any laws. As I said, everybody was over the age of 18, everyone was consensual. So, it was just the kind of thing that maybe people might do in their bedrooms, but they were seeing it in a public space. And then you've got drugs, speed and ecstasy and coke floating around. And, it just created this great atmosphere. And it was just fun, and it was just effortless, I mean, I would always get a, kind of room, a suite at the Park Royal. I'd be there every Thursday night. it was crazy, but it was so crazy that, I had to slow down because I probably wouldn't be here if I continued running clubs. I pretty much got to the end of doing it for about 10 years. And I said, I pretty much have to stop because, because if I keep doing it, I'll be dead. You know what I mean? Because this is just too much of a good thing, I mean, obviously, I really enjoyed doing it, but, that's when I founded the Melbourne Underground Film Festival. I went back to university and I studied philosophy and I began to get back into filmmaking. I finished this film I made in the 90s called Pearls Before Swine. I took that overseas to different film festivals and I began to kind of move back towards the film world a bit more. And also done very well out of running clubs and, but every now and then I would always still do events. And obviously I was still doing Melbourne Underground Film Festival events every year. And that was a kind of another whole kind of dimension of my life. We discovered just about every important filmmaker that's come out of this country the last 25 years. People like James Wan, who did the Saw films, The Conjuring. These are the biggest horror franchises in film history. We're the first film festival in the world to play the work of James Wan. And we discovered people like Scott Ryan, who did that incredible show, Mr. In Between, Patrick Hughes, who made one of the Expendables films with Sylvester Stallone, Greg McLean, who made The Wolf Creek. We discovered all these people. So, it was just great. And that's kind of what I've always been interested in doing. And it was the same with Hellfire. I don't even remember all the people we discovered, you know what I mean? DJs and, you know what I mean? I just knew it was a place where people could come, they could let their hair down, and they could just forget about their worries, and just do whatever the hell they wanted, have a good time, and, make great friends, that last you your whole life, And, people like Spiro and stuff, he always loved Hellfire, he used to come, because he sadly passed away about 5 or 6 years ago, just before the pandemic. And, he was a colourful character, as I'm sure you've heard.
Very colourful. I had a lot to do with him, yeah.
There you go, you know him. There you go. And just fascinating, not everyone is, here with us. Greg Maxwell, who was a regular at my club, he sadly passed away. Scotty Richmond, he was another old mate. He was a very colourful character.
So I really want to get into that Melbourne Underground Film Festival because I know it's been a big part of your life. But before we do, so there was another thing that happened at Hellfire, not in Melbourne, but in Sydney, where there was they call it the Hellfire Massacre.
The Hellfire Murders.
Hellfire Murders, sorry. So
it was around the time, to me it's like, it reminds me of Boogie Nights. You've seen Boogie Nights?
I have.
You know how it's all fun? And then at a certain stage, they go to that guy's house and he's letting off firecrackers and people are getting shot at or whatever. You know what I mean? It felt like that. You know what I mean? It felt like, it'd gone too far or something. You know what I mean? Even though I had absolutely nothing to do with what happened. But what it was is I was running the Sydney club. I don't know how to put this diplomatically. They were very colourful people who ran the venue, Black Market. You know what I mean? And let's just say they had a lot of very interesting Lebanese friends. You know what I mean? Let's put it that way. And, they had a thing called Day Club. And, it was very, bikie gangs and things like this. So it was something involving the Rebels bikie gang and the Banditos. And it wasn't actually on a Hellfire night. That was the Thursday night, but it was on the Sunday, the Day Club. But I sometimes stayed up in Sydney until Sunday afternoon. So I would go to these day clubs, but I wasn't there that time. I remember just waking up at some stage on Sunday, probably at midday, and seeing on the news, it was like triple murder at the Hellfire Club. And I'm like, fuck. You know what I mean? Of course, the club was packed even busier than the following week, which you wouldn't believe. But what happened was there was some dispute between the Banditos and the Rebels, and a book has come out about it. You can look it up online. It's called The Hellfire Massacre or The Black Market Massacre. The guy who was in jail for it, he's got about 30 years in jail for it. He wrote a book about it. It was some kind of dispute where the Banditos turned up to this rebel-controlled club, and which happened to be the club I was also working at. And then they went down into the basement and there was a shootout. 3 people died, And I just remember this thinking, Christ, And that was around the time I thought, I don't know if I want to continue doing this for how long, you know what I mean? Because it was so crazy, you know what I mean? And I'd been at the center of all this, even though I really had nothing to do with it. It was just the fact that the name of my club was linked to this event. And it just seemed like, the nightclub scene could be dangerous back then, you know what I mean? It was the beginning of the Melbourne crime war. As I said, Carl Williams used to come to the Mansion, Hellfire Club, and, all these people started to bump each other off because there was so much money being made in ecstasy and, so much money to be made and all this. It just felt slightly dangerous, you know what I mean? And eventually I just kind of wheedled my way. And also, I didn't enjoy flying up to Sydney every single week. So eventually I just said, look, I'll create the artwork for the club and that I'll come up once a month. So I'd go up there once a month and I would send them. And, I knew roughly what the club was making. And I said, well, I'm making X. Why don't you send me a little bit less, 20% less? And I won't come, but I'll come once a month, So that worked, and it worked for a while. And then eventually it stopped around 2001, 2002. And then Hellfire in Sydney continued on, but it didn't continue on at the same venue. Master Tom, who was the, like Master Perry, he was like the MC of the S&M area. He stayed on after I wasn't coming up there every week. And when eventually I stopped going altogether and I broke off all contact with them because they were a little bit heavy, the people who ran that venue. And I just decided around 2001, I didn't want to have anything to do with them. So I just let it go. And then Master Tom, I think they kept it there for black market for about a year. And then he moved it. They moved it to about 10 different venues. And I sort of stayed friendly with Tom. I knew he was still doing the club. I was already doing Muff. I was doing film work. And, he flew me up for the 20th anniversary, I think, of Hellfire. It would have been around 2012. We caught up then, but we've never really been great friends because, he's basically ripping off my idea, mate. And he wasn't the first one, mate. There's been about 10, 20 people who've ripped off my idea over the years in different ways, But, I kind of ripped it off myself from clubs in Los Angeles. So, these are ideas that are in the zeitgeist, mate,
Yeah, it's such a wild thing when you talk back about your scene. So you're talking 90s, I was in sort of mid-2000s.
When were you born?
I'm 86.
86. Oh, yeah.
But what I love about it is like even my scene, when we started, it's a bunch of young kids creative with an idea and it flourishes into something that, is a scene with all these cool people and it's fucking open-minded and there's all different facets of life. And then the same thing happens. All the drugs are in there and then all the ecstasy comes and then that kind of empowers it even more. And then with the drugs comes the gangsters and then eventually gets to a point where it comes to a crashing end. It's always the same story. And
exactly.
It's such a weird thing because it starts with creative and it starts in a purest place. And then over time it turns into this seedy thing. Talking about Hellfire, right? At the end of it, what do you feel like was the demise of why you decided to close it?
Well, I think it, obviously too, there's an element of fun when you first do something like this because it's something that's like maybe a fetish or like something you have a bit of like a hobby almost, that you have an interest in, you know what I mean? Then you do it every week for 10 years, it becomes tedious. It becomes so you can't even, I would hide away in the office most of the night because I didn't want to see it. When I first started, I loved seeing it. I loved participating in it. I love getting people involved in it. But after doing it every night for twice a week for nearly 10 years, you get sick of it. You know what I mean? And so it was something like that. It's like you get burnt out. And plus, you've got your own stories of, your own drug addictions. I had a coke habit there for a while in the late 90s, that got a bit out of hand, Happy to admit it, you know what I mean? I tried just about everything except heroin and, had a lot of fun, But, it was good to kind of separate myself from that. When I went back to university, I pretty much kicked most drugs. Every now and then if someone, brings out a bag, I'll give it a go. But
So your journey into Muff, right? So Muff is like its own little culture phenomenon. So you've gone from Hellfire into Muff, which is, for anyone who's into films, especially films of, I guess, a different way of thinking, Muff is the place for that. And you said before you went through all the list of people that you've dealt with who've gone on to become stars around the world.
That's right.
Walk me through how you decided to start Muff.
Well, as I said, I was kind of ready to move away. And, I'd finished this film. I shot this film in 1996 called Pearls Before Swine. It took me about 3 years to finish it. It premiered at the Stockholm International Film Festival. Roman Polanski was there that year. I met Roman Polanski. He was a top bloke, really got along with him. And, he was a real colourful character. Then it played at Sitges in Spain. We went there and I hung out with Tony Curtis, who's the father of Jamie Lee Curtis, who was in all those classic films, We got drunk together at the bar, Tony Curtis and I was hanging out with the kids of Gregory Peck. Just incredible people. Apparently Christopher Nolan was there that year with his first film. He was just an unknown, you know what I mean? Then I went to the Busan International Film Festival over in Korea and, hung out with, the guy from the band Goblin, who does the soundtrack to all the Dario Argento films, all various kinds of interesting people. And then we ended up at another film festival in Mexico called the Ajijic Film Festival. It just was something, and I'd done all Hellfire. And I thought, I just want to move into this, So I'd finished my film. I played at these film festivals. And I wanted to play it in Melbourne, but it got rejected from the Melbourne International Film Festival. And, of course, and I knew somebody, Philip Brophy, who sort of knew some people. And I said, come on, shot in Melbourne. This is, it's a good little genre film. Why don't you just play it? And they're like, no, we don't like it. It's too violent. Because it was all full of, S&M and violence and murder and everything, So it was a pretty crazy movie. And they didn't want to play it. So I just wrote this outrage letter saying, this is just shocking, and also I knew how to run events. They didn't know that, because I've been doing Hellfire Club for years. And when they told me to get fucked, I wrote this outrage letter to the Film Net, which is Gawain McLaughlin's Film Net magazine, and about 50 filmmakers wrote back to me and said, my film was rejected because it was a lesbian film. My film was rejected because it was a vampire film. My film was rejected because of this. And I just wrote back to them all and said, you're all accepted. Send me your films. I'm starting a film festival. It's going to be called the Melbourne Underground Film Festival. At the moment, when I started MUF, there were only 2 other underground film festivals in the world. There was the New York Underground Film Festival, and then there was Chicago. And then pretty soon after I opened MUF, the New York Underground folded. So the Chicago Underground Film Festival is the only other. If that closes, MUF is the oldest underground film festival in the world. So, and then everyone began to copy us. After about 6 or 7 years, Stefan Popescu came down we spoke about doing MUF up in Sydney, and then he went and did it himself. He called it the Sydney Underground Film Festival, which is pretty much my fucking idea. But anyway, that's another story. They say that copying you is what's it called?
I think it's imitation is the best source of flattery.
Sincerest form of flattery or something like that. So I've had that happen a lot over the years, but that's okay.
Likewise, I think all good creatives have that happen.
That's right.
It's a bate of my existence also.
Yeah, I'm a real ideas man. That's my speciality. Not always, as perfect following through, but I'm definitely a great ideas man. And we just wanted to do something really interesting. And the first festival was a big success. And then, I had a guy named William Marshall, who was like a film guy who produced a lot of films by Alex Cox. He was involved in Gallipoli, Peter Weir and stuff back from the good old days. And he put in some seed funding to get it going. And, he gave us his office. He was like an entertainment lawyer. He gave us his office whenever we wanted to have meetings and stuff. So we just started doing it that way. And slowly but surely the festival built up, discovered, as I said, the Melbourne International Film Festival has a budget of about $1 million given to it by the state government and the federal government. And, we who've got a tiny, small budget, basically just from the entries we get, we were able to discover just about every important filmmaker to come out of the country, in the last 25 years. Because we accepted everybody. We didn't care if it had a budget or whatever. It just had to be creative. It just had to be original. And we didn't give a shit about political correctness. We didn't give a shit about woke or, whether it had Aborigines in it or not. But if it was good, we'd play it, And that's that. With that simple, philosophy, that we accepted everybody who was good. And that was good.
How was working with some of these guys? Like you talk about the guys that started Saw, Wolf Creek, all these other films. Like how was it working with them in the early days? Because they're fucking now Australian legends.
They are absolute legends. I mean, James Wan, Lee Winnell, they made a film called Stygian. It was into the first MUF. Shannon Young was also involved in that. He went on to do interesting work. But, and then the following year they made a short. This is an interesting story. They made a short. It was called Saw. It had my friend Paul Moda in it, who'd been in all my films, a local actor. And in the film, it was people in a room, and then they had to kind of saw their leg off. It's the basic plot line to Saw. They took it to Film Victoria, and they took it to the Australian Film Commission. And they said, no, get fucked. You know what I mean? And then Saw went on to become the biggest horror franchise in film history that's now been replaced by The Conjuring, which is another creation of James Wan. So these guys have become essentially bigger than Wes Craven, bigger than who created, Nightmare on Elm Street, bigger than, John Carpenter, who created Halloween, you know what I mean? And they said no to it because if they'd said yes to it, this could happen here, you know what I mean? With Australian funding. But no, they went over and I think New Line and a couple other interesting producers over in America had gotten behind it. And, I just think, it's terrible. And part of MUF was about just, for whatever reason, they didn't like genre films. They wanted to make politically correct films involving lesbian Aborigines or something, you know what I mean? Films nobody wants to fucking see, right? You know what I mean? And, I wanted to make balls to the wall, chainsaw, massacre, whatever, you know what I mean? This kind of stuff, that was the kind of thing I liked. And if it was upsetting or provocative, the more I liked it. Saw was exactly the kind of film, And then, as I said, they've remained friendly over the years. I still get messages from James. He's over in Hollywood. He did Aquaman recently. I think he's in the top 10 or 20 biggest earners in film history. He's up there with George Lucas and bloody. Just look it up online. Look up So it's extraordinary. And I met Peter Jackson 30 years ago. For example, when I was working at Beat Magazine, this is before I did Hellfire. Peter Jackson came out to Australia. And I was working for Rob First at Beat Magazine. Rob First asked questions later, of course. That's his nickname, if anyone knows him. He's a lovely guy. And, we're at the Rob Roy, I think, or a hotel we were working. And, they said there's this New Zealand filmmaker, coming out. And I had seen Bad Taste, which was his first film. So we went down, we had lunch together. At this stage, he had nothing on the horizon about doing Lord of the Rings. He was trying to make a film called Meet the Feebles, which is like a Muppets kind of film with gore and chainsaws. They thought he was nuts over in New Zealand. But because there was nothing happening in New Zealand, like literally almost nothing, they funded him. You know what I mean? And the fact that they funded him led directly to Lord of the Rings, which again became one of the greatest, biggest things. And he was an absolute charming guy. And he remains friends with Michael Helms, who is a film writer who's always covered my film work. And Michael Helms often went over to New Zealand to report on what Peter Jackson was doing. But it goes to show I've never had money from the government for any of my films because I'm Mr. Controversial. For whatever reason, I don't like that. But in America, I mean, we made a film, Bloodlust, which was a vampire gangster film, right? We made it in 91. And then, as the film writer said, it's not the world's greatest film. I made it when I was 21. It's not Citizen Kane. But as someone mentioned, it's a vampire gangster film. And then 5 years later, Tarantino with Rodriguez made From Dusk Till Dawn, which is a vampire gangster film. So there you go. I mean, we were doing this stuff. I remember John Hewitt and I, who I did Bloodlust with, we had a serial killer script called Nemesis. It was going to be all about serial killers. And we took that to the funding bodies. This was in 1991. And I said, who the hell wants to see a film about a serial killer?
Me.
And 1 year later, Silence of the Lambs wins the Oscars. So this is the kind of stupidity that we have going on in the local film industry. You just fund people if they're interesting. And now they're finally doing it. You have the Filippo brothers who do...
The Raka Raka boys.
There you go, those guys. They're doing like, Talk to Me and all those great films. They're finally getting behind them. And I think, I at least hope that's part of our influence. The fact that we've just been for years banging on their doors saying, support these guys. Because if you do, the industry will just take off. And, it could have happened 100 times over the last 30 years. So that's what we've been about. And that's what we do.
That's my last question was going to be about Raka Raka, so I'm sort of glad you covered that.
Yeah.
But to end this amazing fucking podcast,
thank you, mate.
I want to say thank you so much, man, for pushing, I guess, the envelope all the time and refusing to accept the norm and being so provocative.
Yep.
So being so provocative, because without people like you, trailblazers, there's not these new scenes and new film guys that are coming through. And like we're screaming out at the moment more than ever for creatives. And without guys like you who sort of started that road, we're never going to have the next generation. So thank you so much for just being a fucking good Australian creative.
Thank you, mate. Well, thank you for having us. Thank you for doing this show. I really watched your videos and I love what you're doing yourself because there's some important history here that I think people need to know about. And that's what it is all about. Don't ever take no from anybody. That's what I'd say to people. If you want to be a creative, whether it be in the club scene or the film scene or a musician, a DJ, when you get that no, say fuck you. Whether it be your parents, whether it be a school teacher, whether it be just the world, say no, say fuck you. I'm going to do it, I'm going to try. And if you just have that guts, to give it a go, you'd be amazed how fucking far you can go. And you may not end up in Hollywood or a rich and famous, but you'll have a tremendous trip along the way and it'll just be good.
You'll have a good time doing it.
You will indeed.
So fuck you.
Fuck you. That's right. That's the philosophy.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny.